And for our panel, we'll now have all of our speakers join us on the stage to share their viewpoints on the growth of EV. Great. So thanks everyone for your presentations, and what I wanted to do here is really kind of get everyone together to have a bit more of a dialogue around kind of what we see as being some of these challenges as we build for this new EV demand, and have a discussion kind of with the group. I mean, I think as discussed before, EV industry's growth is basically exploding because of demand, whether actual real demand or demand that's being promised. For example, in Europe, a recent report by Ernst & Young and Eurelectric projected about 130 million electric vehicles on the road by 2035. And that means there needs to be charging infrastructure to support that. That's a current base right now of 5 million vehicles going to 65 million vehicles by 2030, and then doubling to the 130 million electric vehicles by 2035. And that's quite a few vehicles and not enough chargers. They report back that it was about 10 years to install 400,000 chargers, and now there needs to be about 500,000 chargers every year till 2030, and about 1 million between 2030 and 2035. 80% of those, or a majority of those, are going to be at home, where 80% of charging occurs. But as this kind of growth occurs in places like Europe, where maybe at home you don't have charging, a place to put your own charging infrastructure, you're going to be there's going to be a greater portion of public infrastructure that'll be needed. As mentioned before, maybe plug and charge. ISO 15118 can help, but currently there's 3 cars that do that: the Porsche Taycan, the Ford Mach-E, and Tesla that can do that. And it's a long ways. It's a start, still a far way off from being standard issue in terms of the user experience, or in terms of deployment and being made available to more vehicles, as well as to more infrastructure, charging infrastructure. So we want to basically discuss these. I have some questions kind of lined up for the panelists. Really, for this first question, I kind of want to put this over to Nicholas and Evgeny. Do you find that the OEMs are beginning to work closely with power and charge point industries? What could be better? What are you seeing as you implement with your customers?
So let me go first, Nicholas. I know you're coming out of Volvo, and you'll have much more insight as to how the OEMs think about it. What we have observed is that one of the key issues that exists out there when talking about this complexities of EV charging is no one really realizes how hard it is and how complex the industry itself. Because when you think about, hey, there's charge point, and you think that they do the whole cycle of EV charging, unfortunately, that's not the case. As we started looking deeper into the industry itself, you have, station hardware supplier, and those may have other suppliers under them. Then you have software suppliers, and you have another layer, and there's data layer. Like all of these layers, they're not easily understood, especially in the automotive industry, just because why would we care type of thing, right? Because the way how originally this whole EV charging story started is, OEMs would focus on building the electric vehicle itself, and then hopefully energy industry will pick up and they'll figure it out for us type of thing. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. So hopefully, as we at least, the word in the market is that in hydrogen, they're thinking differently as to, hey, this needs to come together as one rather than a super fragmented marketplace upfront, because many of the issues that, including what Adam was talking about, fragmented data out there about EV charging and all those issues about location and how to pay and all those different closed loop systems, all this came from disorganization of the marketplace itself. Do OEMs have to pick it up? I'm not sure, but it definitely needs to be something of a consortium, and there needs to be more clarity and understanding of how hard the industry is. So I wouldn't say that OEMs are doing enough, but at least they need to learn a little more about the complexities of the EV charging industry itself.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank Evgeny and Adam for great presentations. It was really awesome to listen to you guys, and I agree with what you said. I think that was really insightful. To answer your question, I don't see how the OEMs would be able to solve this problem simply by interacting with a lot of different charging service providers, because actually, going back to what I said, it's so fragmented industries. Both the car industry and the whole infrastructure is fragmented. And as Evgeny pointed out, charging is fragmented in different layers. You've got the someone actually providing the charging station itself, someone else actually providing the power grid, and even third entities providing the power through that power grid. I don't see how any one OEM would ever be able to just by putting more effort into integrating with infrastructure and charging service providers would essentially even make a dent in that problem. I'm actually going to reiterate what you said, Adam. I really think that we're not heading to something that will get better. It's going to get 10 times worse, really. And I love driving electric vehicles, but only for everyday usage. That's what I've learned. And I've also learned and realized that everyday usage is not what I do every day. It's just what I might be doing like 40% or 70% of the time. But for everything else, currently it's nowhere near good enough.
Adam, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I often have a lot of thoughts and questions. Yeah, I think so. Just to first of all, just to reiterate a little bit what has been said, that yeah, the OEMs are maybe not working closely enough yet with the charging point operators, and that is, I think, is a problem which comes across in the whole EV ecosystem. So if we zoom out a little bit and we look at what makes EV so difficult, one of the things is that we have this whole new industry, or this whole concept, let's say, which is the electric vehicle, which is disrupting two massive industries, right? So one of these. Oh, thank you very much. I got a fan for my presentation. So, we have EV, and it's sitting between two very big mega industries: the automotive industry and the energy industry. And neither of these want to be disrupted, and they are also not very good at speaking with each other. That ends up being an issue now, because if we bring in government to that, let's look at different government policies around EV at the moment. And I keep talking about the UK government. The wrong reason for that is that's the most recent one I read, but it makes all of the points. So the UK government, similar to a lot of other countries out there, has put out this strategy now about how they should invest into public charging to encourage electric vehicles to come about. Now, if we dive deeper into that government paper, just as an example to make my point, we can see that the UK government wants to invest $1.6 billion or 1.6 billion pounds, into the EV industry, into public charging. And they say they're going to invest 1.6 billion pounds so that they can build 300,000 charging points. But they also say that they don't know whether 300,000 will be enough potentially they might need 700,000 charging points, which would then double the amount of money needed. And the reason they don't know whether that's enough is because it all comes down to how efficiently an electric car driver charges and what are these charging patterns. So suddenly we can see there's this huge issue out there that you've got the automotive sector and you've got then the energy sector and you've got the driver. No one understands each other. And if we put a price figure on top of that, that's £1 billion, right? From a UK government perspective. So it's a huge problem across the globe, and no one is really speaking to each other enough to analyze how we can get to that efficiency of charging. Another reason why that's important is because the two sides of that coin, so the automotive and the energy sector, have opposing aims on how we should roll out infrastructure, because we all want to give electric car drivers what we call charging confidence. But the way that the OEMs want to do that is by providing lots and lots of charging points, which are going to remain empty, so that when you want a charging point, you know that you can get one. But at the same time, the infrastructure or the CPOs, the biggest threat that they have to their business model is the lack of utilization. So what they have the opposite problem. How can they maximize utilization of that charging point? And this is where we're going to see a clash, where one side wants to get loads of charging points out there, which are half used, and the other side wants to get all the charging points, which are used 100% of the time. And how do we find that balance to create a better user experience? It needs to come down to better software and better interactions. So, I think that was the long answer. The short answer is there isn't enough going on between the OEMs and the CPOs, and we need much bigger collaboration there in order to uncover that aim of making charging much more efficient rather than just lots of empty charging points.
I couldn't agree more. And that's actually just to stress that point you made there, Adam. And I think that's why it's so important that we actually truly connect vehicles, so that you actually can get communication going between the cars and the infrastructure, because otherwise there's no way to solve that problem of car manufacturers wanting to have empty charging stations available everywhere. And of course, charging station providers, they don't care if the line is long. That's just good for them. And that optimizing that problem without communicating won't happen. And I mean communication between the car and the operators themselves. And to a large degree, I also think there's like this putting your head in the sand behavior right now. You kind of just keep going and you see that there's a big problem up ahead, but you just hope or expect someone else to solve it for you, because you realize that you can't do it yourself, or it's too difficult or complex to do it yourself. And this then happens at the same time as everyone wants, like I said in my presentation, everybody wants a maximum slice of the pie. And that is also kind of stopping collaboration, where everyone is like protective and trying to hog their piece of it, instead of realizing that if we do it together, the total piece will actually start to grow instead.
Well, so let's focus on maybe the OEM side, and what the OEMs might be able to do. I mean, are you seeing the platforms and the applications and the software? It's only actually more recently that you're starting to see telematics applications begin to mature. And now you're asking OEMs to build entire software platforms to make that data available to now a whole new participant. Is that something that you feel is being done right? We see OEMs building entire software teams. What are your feelings on how OEMs, what grade would you give OEMs on their digital platform development?
I don't want to grade them.
I guess you wouldn't exist as a startup if
no, but I mean it's much better than it used to be. And there's with some common software platforms in vehicles. Obviously, you have Android Automotive, but you've also actually got some other initiatives recently that actually makes it possible to run software across vehicles. But it's certainly not. Cars are still not connected, and I think even though they're running, for example, Android Automotive, it's still kind of run as a closed garden system. You're not really opening up in the same way that phone industry did or were able to. I think the OEMs need to start realizing that connected devices are more valuable than disconnected devices. That's the reason why people now pay $1,000 for a phone. 15 years ago, you'd pay $100 instead. The reason you pay $1,000 is because you actually can connect with anything from your phone. And once car companies start realizing that, they will see that it actually brings value to their product, the main thing that they're actually providing. And it's that level of openness. I'm not saying that we should have 1 million apps in the cars, but there needs to be an open system. You need to be open with data and communication. Data only has a value when you share it. Actually, if you keep it safely locked away somewhere, it's pointless and worthless. So you need much greater degrees of openness in the car industry to start with, and it's not even close to good enough. At least that's my grade.
I would actually, thank you, Nicholas, for this view. I would actually have a little bit more optimistic and positive view of the OEMs, because even if going very deep into the software layer is one thing, but organizationally, OEMs actually realize that need. When we talk about electric vehicles, they actually do start new programs completely. And more importantly, marketing teams and technical teams, engineering teams are designed differently than for ICE vehicles. And that demonstrates the commitment of the OEMs to figure it out. More importantly, when we present our things to them, they sometimes are more willing to push our type of solution to the EV teams because A, they're the priority for the OEMs, because that's clear, that's where the future is. B, those are just a little bit more, as you say, more open, Nicholas, right? As they're looking outside and understanding more of what is happening there. The key issues that we observe, and that is something we have been solving ourselves in our company, is when it comes to automotive engineering, automotive background, embedded systems, electronics control units, RTOS, real-time operating systems, CAN, sensors, this type of engineering, it works on a very different scale and cycle and development cycle and mentality and mindset than IT software, right?
Yes.
Because software is like, oh, we need daily stand-ups, 15 minutes, right? Agile development, we need to make sure that we can control those issues. You don't do anything every day on an ECU within the car. It's just not how it works, right? So bringing together those cultures is super, super hard. And in my view, actually, again, going back to the thought that do OEMs need to really do this? They need to understand, yes. But ideally, in the end, what OEM have been doing the best for the last 100 years is assembling the suppliers in the right way. An ICE vehicle has 100 components, 10,000 components. EV, okay, have about 600 components. But I mean, it's a lot of suppliers, and making sure that this device works for 10 years and doesn't break down. God, this is the most complex and most reliable device on the planet. Even the phones, right? We change them every year, Nicholas, maybe every 2 years. You don't do that with the car.
But even with the phones, typically made by very mature companies when it comes to, or fairly mature at least when it comes to software development, but they're not building all the software themselves. They're not even throttling all the software through them. They don't have teams large enough to manage all the potential charging service providers in the world. And of course, car companies cannot do that either. And I think that is the shift. I agree with you that the car industry, and I hope I didn't come across as too pessimistic, the car industry has moved in the right direction. And I mean, you see much greater use of third-party software built by others running in different car systems in the infotainment domain, at least. But it's still too little, and it's still too controlled by OEMs, I believe. I think it needs to be more focused on trying to enable as much as possible. That's and not having the focus of the OEM ultimately having to build or be responsible for everything. That's Apple are not responsible for everything running on an iPhone, and Samsung's not responsible for everything I run on my Android phone. And that's a completely that is a mind shift, I believe.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, touching on a point here, which is that we talk about, the question is a question that might be commonly framed. That is, how are the OEMs producing the correct software, for example? And there's a bit of a trick question sometimes, because the software itself or the technology isn't necessarily the hardest part. So let's just take EV charging, for example. A lot of that is based on OCPI. The software, the technology is there. If it's a technology question, you would fix it in a week. But the issue then comes in, you're right, in how the old models are, how the collaboration is focused, and what the agendas of each of the parties are, and that's what makes it much more complicated. So, what I think a lot of car companies are doing very well now, for example, is opening up to app stores and third-party developers, for example. That's one thing which is a big step in the right direction, because it just means that you can then harness all of that power of developers around the world who have different ideas to what you might have in your own automotive HQ. What is quite difficult still is the whole procurement process, traditional procurement processes of OEMs, which were set up probably initially for, say, machinery or engineering or parts, and don't necessarily fit to software companies. That can sometimes be very much a challenge, I would say, for software companies that want to supply OEMs. And then we can see different agendas at play, in particular in the EV space, where we are moving into this new market. And quite frankly, the business models in EV, no matter where you look, are very, very uncertain. And everyone's quite nervous, I would say, about where they're going to make their money. And let's take one classic example, which is the plug and charge protocol. So ISO 15118 for electric car charging. From a user perspective, it sounds fantastic, which is, you take the plug, you plug in, the car starts charging, and you pay somehow, somewhere. You don't have to care about it. It's all done. So the question then comes, why isn't software like that being rolled out everywhere automatically? And it's because, I think, of the different agendas between the two different parts. So the automotive companies, for example, wanting to have some control and maybe monopolize a little bit the user and keep that within their environment. And then that negates the impact for the benefit of that process for the charging point operator. And the energy companies, who then might feel that they're losing too much power or control over to the car companies. So in the end, you can talk about how we move different software together, but it comes down, I think, to this point about business collaborations, aligning on agendas, and then trying to create something which, to be quite frank, sounds quite socialist in what is a capital market. So it's a really tough challenge.
No, but I mean, you're right, Adam, because the problem here is not really building software that does something. It's the collaboration between hundreds of different car companies with thousands of different service providers, and suddenly you have the permutations will be like 100,000, and that's actually why I think Covisa, why I said that I believe Covisa is really in a very important position to be able to make those connections between companies and become this umbrella organization actually supporting the greater industry here, and that is really the problem, how you connect all these different entities. And I don't see how any one OEM could do it by themselves, or any one charging provider could do it by themselves. And plug and pay is that's all great, because the actual payment step is painful, but that's only one of the few steps. First, I need to find the charging station. It needs to work. And of course, it's nice if that could be solved, but I think charging is painful, even more painful when you're not at a charging station. So you need communication well before you're at the charging station.
So Adam, you see a lot of the other side of the equation with parking and charging. Can you tell us what you're seeing? Are things improving, or what is the level of preparation, or what would you tell your partners that you're working with? How can things improve? You mentioned before that just even the data is not necessarily cleansed, which kind of seems shocking, because if you're a charge point operator, don't you want to know where all your assets are, and yet and what state they're in, because a charge point that can't even take a car is a non-productive asset. So what are you seeing? You know, is there improvement there? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so you're right. It is shocking that it seems shocking, of course, that charging point operators, for example, don't always provide the exact data, but it comes down in the end to priorities. And we have to remember as well that charging point operators there's many different flavors of charging point operators in their business model. So you get some which would sell the charging point, and then that's the sale done. So they don't. It's not that they don't care, but they don't prioritize getting the right information. And you get others who own and operate that station. They want to keep the driver using their application. So maybe they don't prioritize sending correct information to third-party services and all that. So it all gets quite complicated. Exactly. And then as the end result. But I think what we are seeing now, over time, so I think this is good news for the people that are talking about collaborations. I think over time we are starting to see much more collaboration in terms of the charging infrastructure. So we can see, let's just start with the example in the US market. So when I started off in this industry back in the early 2010s, the US market was incredibly running on verticals. So you had companies like ChargePoint, for example, that would own the whole vertical. These could then be mirrored in other countries across Europe, and they would try to keep everything to themselves and fight the competition. I think since we've seen much more investment going in through, say, like Biden's plans for EV, for example, which has encouraged companies to focus on building charging points rather than worry too much about the economics of the business model. We've seen, and once we've seen these companies having to compete with, say, Tesla, who were trying to perfect its user experience, we've seen much more openness. So in the US market now, there's roaming agreements which take place between all the different networks. So these are all opening up. We're seeing across Europe now laws coming in, so mandating the opening up of charging networks. So in Germany and in the UK, wherever it might be, if you're putting a public charging point in, you need to make it publicly accessible rather than just through a single platform. So we are seeing that change, and we're also seeing now the mandating of different payment methods. So, for example, credit card payments at charging points, which, from some according to some arguments, would then increase the usability of charging points for certain people if you can just go and scan a credit card. So I think that we are slowly getting there. Companies are collaborating a lot more. We're seeing more usability. We're seeing more easy user features coming up. This is happening everywhere. But at the same time, this is all data that needs to be managed. It needs to be put in the right way, and that is the scale of the job at hand here. Is how you bring all of that together and how you provide it in APIs for other players to use. And that's why then we still have to put lots of time together in combining, say, the parking data and the charging data and making that accessible.
Great, thank you. Well, we're coming up on time here. Just one last question for everyone. What are you all provide software to OEMs and to customers? What do you see on your roadmap that kind of helps address these problems? What can you tell us about what you're doing in the next 12 or 18 months that'll basically capture some of this demand and hopefully support the deployment?
John, let me start there real quick. So one thing which we had a really interesting discussion here in Germany with some of the tier 1 colleagues here. The very important question came up, which relates to something that Adam and particularly Nicholas was talking about. Who needs to take on this problem? Who's going to be the solution for this? Who's going to actually bring these pieces together from the business collaborations and making sure that the marketplace does work? right? And obviously, we're in this game usually tier 2, tier 3. Parkopedia also, well, I know Parkopedia work with OEMs as well, like we do directly, but essentially we're tier 2, tier 3 in that game. But who is going to do this? It's not going to be the OEM. It's going to be the tier 1. That is my very strong belief, because that is where the expertise is, the engineering expertise is. And there is an understanding of the business and the services business, and it's just a service business by itself by default. So I do believe that the tier 1s are going to actually come up with the aggregator, orchestrator, whatever other type of solution out there. And that is what we see going on, as integrators are going to be those major engineering savvy tier 1 supplier companies working with providers like us, like Parkopedia, like anyone else, building together those pieces which have to be combined. Will OEMs do this? Yes, they understand it. And the OEMs have been focusing on this. But the key is that, do they have to do it? I think that the tier 1s will always be there in the picture. And that is with whom we would be integrating most of our solutions in the coming 12 to 18 months, as you said, John. But obviously, OEMs being there is the ultimate direct buyer of this type of services, who still control the cloud, by the way. That is the key. We shouldn't forget that when it comes to connectivity, when it comes to services, the ultimate controller is the OEM, who have the cloud and the connectivity, right? The tier 1 just supplies the actual kind of pieces of it. But that is what the thought is, John, really, to live here.
Great, thanks. Nicholas?
Well, yeah, I think the way we're trying to contribute to solving this problem is really by connecting vehicles. Actually, exactly what you talked about, Evgeny, how OEMs currently are controlling the clouds, which I think is inhibiting communication with vehicles. That is what we're actually trying to address, make it possible to connect with any vehicle without having to be limited by whatever restrictions or limitations different OEMs have on their different proprietary cloud solutions. So we're building a platform to enable bidirectional communication with vehicles to and from any vehicle for any third party. And that's where I think that's one small piece, but essential piece to the puzzle of solving electrical vehicle infrastructure and make sure that anyone actually can communicate with cars in a sensible way. Yeah, I don't want to sound too much as a car salesman, and I hope you're not as tired on my voice as I am. I'm tired of hearing myself talking. And I think Adam and Evgeny are saying so much smarter things than I am, so I'm going to shut up now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicholas. And Adam?
You set me up now. So. I'm not tired of your voice, Nicholas. I've recorded it and I will listen to it on the way home as well. So over the next 12 to 18 months, John, we are, as mentioned, we're doubling down on the Park and Charge product. So this is the best way that we feel is how we can redefine that user journey. So Nicholas, to prove I was listening, one thing you mentioned was not being at a charging point is more painful than being at a charging point. I absolutely agree with that. So how can we then redefine that user journey to make sure that we're capturing all of the steps in charging an electric car, including before you get to that charging point, right? So you get there, you need to know what the parking location is, you need to combine that data, you need to make it easy to charge, and then finally getting the bill and the stuff that happens afterwards. So we're doubling down on that with the Park and Charge product, bringing all of those data sets together, and we've already got POCs lined up with a number of tier 1s and OEMs, and hopefully going to SOP very soon. If anyone on the call is interested in discussing that further, then that would also be what I'm doing in the next 12 to 18 months, and I would love to do it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone, Adam, Jenny, Nicholas. Thanks for joining the panel and for everything, that all the presentations and your insight. That concludes our session, our in-vehicle payments and EV charging session for the Covisa all-member meeting. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the content. And if there are any questions for our panelists or for myself or for Mike, please feel free to email